Okay, we're continuing on with the emergence of the U.S. as a world power. Let me say that it's going to be a lot easier for you to follow along here if you go to the study materials module and print out the class notes worksheets. Okay, for Unit 2, they'll be designated as Unit 2, and if you got at least the emergence of the U.S. as a world power in front of you, that's kind of the roadmap to where I'm going. That's the outline of what I'm presenting. So just helps you make sense of it. Okay, origins of American imperialism. Sounding like a left-wing critic here. And at this point, if I were in a classroom with my usual maps, I would pull one down that showed the continental United States, and I could point out to you how the United States grew territorially as it spread across the continent. For example, until after the Revolution, or till the end of the Revolution, it's just the 13 colonies. That doesn't include Georgia. It's the eastern seaboard up through what is now, but wasn't yet, Maine, out to the Appalachian Mountains. That's what it was. The treaty ending the war more than doubled that. Our claim went all the way to the Mississippi River, up to Canada, including the southern shores of the Great Lakes. Still did not include Florida or the coastal areas of Alabama or Mississippi. That's 1783 to 1803. In 1803, we purchased a vaguely defined area called Louisiana from France. And since at the time very little was known about the landforms or landmarks out there, it was just sort of a claim to grab whatever we could claim. The western boundary of it was not specifically determined until 1819, okay? And that was done by a treaty we made with Spain in 1819. In case I should ever ask, it's called either the Transcontinental Treaty or the Adams-Onis Treaty, O-N-I-S, for the Spanish diplomat who negotiated it. And we acquired Spain's claim on Florida at that time. Anyway, it follows the familiar eastern boundary of Texas up to, I think, the 49th parallel, which goes out to the Pacific, and then up to, I think, the Snake River up to the Columbia. It did not include the Pacific Northwest. That was the western boundary of Louisiana. That's in 1803, so we're marching across the continent. In the 1840s, what would eventually be the lower 48 states takes their shape, okay? In 1842, I think it was, we made a treaty with Britain where we established the northern boundary of Maine, which had become a state in 1820. And we made a deal with Britain where we split an area known as the Oregon Country. By extending a boundary we drew between the U.S. and Canada in 1819, I think, extended that on out to the Pacific. And that would include what we acquired up there was our first ever Pacific Ocean frontage, present-day states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, roughly. Okay? Same year, we were involved in a war with Mexico over where the southern boundary of Texas was. Texas had won its independence from Mexico in 1836 and had finally, after repeated efforts, been annexed as the 28th state by the United States in 1845. Mexico had long since yielded up its claim on Texas, but they still insisted that the Nueces River, which comes out at Corpus Christi, was the southern boundary of Texas, as it had been when Texas was a Mexican state long ago. But this war was fought. The United States won, establishing the Rio Grande as the border. And what that left, this is in 1848. Same year, same treaty that established that, the Mexican government simply gave, or the word is used only when one country gives land to another, they ceded, I'll put it on the screen here, the area between the Rio Grande and the Pacific. So the U.S. acquires what's going to be about a third of New Mexico, all of Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and California. And the last little patch there, there's a river in southern Arizona called the Gila River. And the United States bought from Mexico an area south of the Gila. It's basically pictures southern Arizona. Bought that from Mexico in 1853 for $10 million. So that's only 80 years, from 1783 to 1853, to acquire all the land that would be involved in the lower 48 states. I would tell you all that, and I would ask you a question which almost no one ever, tries to answer, although you could have either opinion. Was that expansion across the continent an example of imperialism? Think about it. Okay? You can make a case either way, but a little bit surprisingly, professional historians who tend to lean to the left politically, even they concede that no, this was not imperialism. Why? Because the area was settled, it was organized into territories which were later admitted to the Union as states on a fully equal footing. To satisfy the definition of an empire, you'd have to have, what would make us an empire? Let's say we still just had the original 13 states, and that was it. And they were ruling the rest of the continent as a second-class, imperial possession. That would be imperialism. So, our advance across the North American continent, not an example of imperialism. I said that to say this. What we did at the end of the 19th century was imperialism, with the United States acquiring territorial possessions offshore. We'll get there. Now, the actual questions here. First one, what economic forces drove Europe's revived interest in imperialism in the last quarter of the 19th century? It's all about economics. Western Europe, has had two great eras of imperialism, sometimes called colonialism. The first began with the discovery of America in 1492 and continued on to the late 18th century when the United States won its independence. That would represent a partial breakup of the British Empire. And for reasons I'll tell you about here in a minute, European countries that had possessions held on to them if they could, but they're not out shopping for more. They got something else going on. So that's the first great era of imperialism, successful enough that within, say, a quarter of a millennium after Columbus's discovery, let's say by 1750, the entire Western Hemisphere, every square inch of it, was claimed, if not governed, if not inhabited, by Europeans and their descendants. Even the original languages are all but gone. Now, the middle third of the 19th century, Europe has got imperialism on hold. They're holding on to what they've got, but they're not looking for more. Why is that? Because the Industrial Revolution, which had begun in Britain as far back as the 1760s, spread gradually from northwest to southeast across Europe. First, like maybe the Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, France, Belgium. Spain was kind of left out for a while. Then down across Italy, and then southeastern Europe, and all that. So it sort of spreads through from northwest to southeast. All of Europe's energy and resources were going into industrialization. And that was what occupied their time and their energy and their attention. However, eventually, ironically, industrialization itself put in play economic forces which led to a second, much shorter era of European imperialism that was about the last third or so of the 19th century, picking up steam as it went. And as I say, there were economic forces that drove this. Industrialized countries need raw materials. They have to have raw materials, and no country in the world, not even the largest ones, are completely self-sufficient in raw materials. So, Since in those days they still saw international trade as basically hostile competition rather than um, mutually beneficial trade, they're trying to lock down sources of raw materials and keep their competitors out. Now, south of the European continent is Africa. Africa is incredibly rich in natural resources and populated at the time by people who were maybe even millennia behind Europe in terms of technological development. So for Europeans, it was simply too easy. It was too tempting just to walk in and stake out parts of Africa and claim exclusive control. So the first focus of this second era of imperialism was Africa, and the Africans were ill prepared to defend themselves. The Europeans could have purchased the stuff they needed from the Africans. That would have worked, but taking over was just too easy. The Europeans had modern weapons, they had well organized military forces. The Africans were nowhere near being prepared to resist that. So there's a feeding frenzy, which, when it was over, only left one independent country left in Africa, and that's Ethiopia. Ethiopia is in northeastern Africa, just south of the Red Sea, or the Arabian Gulf as it's sometimes called. Persian Gulf, some people call it. Okay, that was it. All the others had been taken over. So Britain had quite a bit. Germany, which had just unified and they were intensely nationalistic, they came late to the party. They picked up what they could. France, Belgium. Could you find Belgium without a magnifying glass? French-speaking country south of the Netherlands. Belgium claimed an area over 100 times its own size. They didn't have the resources to actually control that, so what they did was make deals with local warlords that they could just do whatever they wanted as long as the Belgians got the stuff they wanted. Okay, and it was very bad. There are places in Africa that are among the worst places to be in the whole world, in spite of the fact that it's a beautiful continent with a good climate and no shortage of clever people. But it's a terrible, terrible situation even today where the Belgians ruled. So, a feeding frenzy. All right. The next focus was coastal China, the China trade. China then and now has the largest population in the world. At the time, their government was monarchical. It was old. It was corrupt. And again, they do not have the physical means to defend themselves now. There's simply too many Chinese. So the Europeans are not trying to move in and take over that entire enormous country. What they were doing was claiming exclusive privileges in Chinese seaports. The Chinese government could easily be bribed to grant what were called spheres of influence, where 6 countries, Britain, Germany, France, I think Italy, Russia, and Japan is involved in this. Each of them had one or more spheres of influence, that is, be a Chinese seaport, which they basically controlled, and they wouldn't let their competitors put their ships in there. Okay, so that was that kind of imperialism. And here we are. We'll get back in a minute. It's a search for raw materials. It's also a search for captive markets. Let me see what I can do here. These are industrialized countries. They're producing consumer goods at unprecedented rates. And they don't have a concept of mutually beneficial competition with other countries around about. And I'm going to have to put this on hold and come back to it in part 3.